When the SS Schenectady sat peacefully at the dock in Portland, Oregon on January 16, 1943, nobody expected what happened next. The brand new Liberty ship, fresh from the assembly line and loaded with cargo, simply split in half. Not from a torpedo, not from rough seas. The ship tore itself apart while tied to the pier, the crack propagating through the hull with a sound witnesses described as a rifle shot echoing across the harbor. Within weeks, reports flooded into the Maritime Commission, ships cracking open in the middle of the Atlantic, hulls splitting along their welds in calm waters. By the time engineers started connecting the dots, more than 2,500 Liberty ships had reported serious structural failures. 19 had broken completely in two. 3 had vanished at sea with all hands. The United States had built an armada that was destroying itself, and nobody knew why. The Liberty ship program was supposed to be America's industrial triumph. After Pearl Harbor, the nation needed cargo vessels fast, faster than any shipyard had ever produced them. Traditional shipbuilding took months, sometimes years. The war wouldn't wait that long. Henry Kaiser and the Maritime Commission promised a revolution, ships built like automobiles rolling off assembly lines, fully welded construction instead of rivets, prefabricated sections assembled by workers with minimal training, speed above all else. They delivered on that promise. The average Liberty ship took just 42 days to build, the record set by the SS Robert E. Peary in November 1942 stood at an astonishing 4 days and 15 hours from keel laying to launch. Newsreels showed workers swarming over hulls, sparks flying, cranes swinging massive sections into place. America was outbuilding the enemy by orders of magnitude. Then the ships started dying. The Maritime Commission launched an emergency investigation. Naval architects scrutinized the steel specifications. Metallurgists examined weld samples. Engineers analyzed the all-welded construction technique that had replaced traditional riveted joints. Every expert had a theory. The steel was too brittle. The welds were improperly executed. The designs had stress concentration points at the square corners of cargo hatches. They were all partially right, but they were missing the fundamental problem, and it would take someone who wasn't an engineer to see it. Bessie Hamill worked the night shift at Kaiser's Richmond shipyard in California. She was one of thousands of women who had joined the wartime workforce, taking jobs that would have been unthinkable a few years earlier. Hamill's job was straightforward. Follow the welding procedures specified by the engineering department. Start at the edges of steel plates and work your way in, or run long continuous welds across sections. Do it fast. Keep production moving. But Hamill noticed something the engineers hadn't. When she followed the standard procedure, welding from the outside edges inward, the steel plates would warp and buckle. Even before the sections were assembled into a ship, she could see stress patterns forming, the metal trying to tear itself apart as it cooled. The more she welded, the more obvious it became. The welding sequence itself was locking enormous residual stresses into the hull structure. In November 1943, Hamill did something that broke every rule of the shipyard hierarchy. She went to her supervisor and demanded a meeting with management. She brought examples, steel test plates she had welded using different sequences. The plates welded from outside in showed obvious warping and stress patterns, but plates she had welded starting from the center and working outward were flat, with minimal distortion. The engineering department's initial response was dismissal. Bessie Hamill was a night shift welder, not a degreed engineer. She hadn't studied metallurgy or structural mechanics. What could she possibly know about residual stress that they didn't? But Hamill was persistent, and the crisis was deepening. More ships were failing. Sailors were refusing to board Liberty ships, calling them suicide boxes. The entire logistics backbone of the American war effort was at risk. Finally, her supervisor agreed to run tests. When the results came back, they were stunning. Welding from the center outward as Hamill had suggested, reduced residual tensile stress from more than 30,000 psi down to just 12,000 psi. The difference wasn't marginal. It was revolutionary. Henry Kaiser himself reviewed the findings. Within weeks, the decision was made to completely overhaul the welding procedures for an entirely new class of ship. But the engineering department faced an enemy more dangerous than any battlefield opponent, their own institutional pride. And they had no intention of letting an outsider's simple observation embarrass them. The problem with welding isn't just about joining two pieces of metal. When you heat steel to its melting point and then let it cool, it contracts. That contraction creates stress. If you weld along the edges of a large steel section first, you're essentially building a rigid frame. When you then weld the interior sections, they contract against that already solid frame. The stresses have nowhere to go. They're locked into the structure, waiting for the right conditions: cold seawater, a stress concentration point, the vibration of a ship's engine to trigger a catastrophic brittle fracture. Welding from the center outward does the opposite. You start where the stresses will be highest, at the geometric center of the assembly, and work toward the edges. As each successive weld cools and contracts, the stress can dissipate toward the free edges rather than accumulating in the middle. It's not rocket science. It's practical observation from someone who spent every night watching how metal behaved. Hamill's insight required an additional innovation: alternating weld locations to prevent heat buildup. Instead of running continuous long welds that would progressively heat an entire section, the new procedure called for welders to jump around the structure, working in a spiral or radial pattern from the center. After every 10 welds, large assemblies would go into stress relief ovens heated to 2100 degrees Fahrenheit, allowing the crystalline structure of the steel to relax and release internal tensions. The impact on structural integrity was dramatic. When engineers tested hull sections built with the old method against sections using Hamill's sequence, the difference was visible without instruments. The old sections showed obvious warping, with some plates bending as much as several inches. The new sections were flat and true. More importantly, when stressed to failure in cold conditions simulating North Atlantic waters, the old sections cracked and propagated brittle fractures rapidly. The new sections absorbed far more energy before failing, and cracks that did form arrested quickly rather than zipping through the entire structure. But this revelation created a massive problem. You couldn't just change the welding procedure on a ship that was already under construction. The Liberty ships rolling down the production lines in early 1944 were committed to the old methods. Thousands of workers had been trained in those sequences. Retraining would take time and slow production, at least initially. The first Victory ship, built entirely with the new welding procedures, took 18 days to complete, 4 times longer than Kaiser's record-breaking Liberty ship. The Navy and Maritime Commission had to make a choice: keep building fast but fatally flawed ships, or slow down and build them right. Meanwhile, the Liberty ship's problems extended beyond just welding sequences. The steel itself was part of the equation. Standard carbon steel, perfectly adequate for most applications, had an ugly characteristic. Below about 40 degrees Fahrenheit, it became brittle. The steel's ductile to brittle transition temperature, the point where it stops bending and starts shattering, was dangerously close to the water temperatures in the North Atlantic, where most of the ships operated. The engineering solution was to modify the steel chemistry by reducing carbon content, increasing manganese, and adding a small percentage, just 0.25% of nickel metallurgists, created what they called killed steel. The new alloy had a ductile to brittle transition temperature down near 5 degrees Fahrenheit, giving Victory ships a much wider safety margin in cold waters. The specification was approved in March 1944, just as the first Victory ships were entering production. Then there were the stress concentrators, the square corners of cargo hatches, where stress would multiply by a factor of 3.5 or more. The solution was elegantly simple: round the corners, By adding curved fillets at hatch corners and other geometric discontinuities, engineers reduced stress concentration factors by more than 60%, from 4.0 times nominal stress down to less than 1.8 times. It wasn't revolutionary engineering. It was basic principles that should have been applied from the start. But speed had trumped thoroughness in the Liberty ship design. The Victory ship wasn't just one fix. It was a comprehensive redesign that addressed multiple failure modes simultaneously: welding sequence to reduce residual stress, improve steel to resist brittle fracture, rounded corners to eliminate stress concentration points, and strategically place crack arrestor seams, riveted sections that would stop any crack from propagating the entire length of the hull. Production required its own revolution. The new welding procedures demanded strict quality control. Each weld had to be numbered and tracked. Welders had to be retrained and certified. Magnetic particle inspection, ultrasonic testing, and X-ray examination became standard. The massive prefabricated sections that made Liberty ships possible were replaced with smaller modules that could be welded under controlled conditions before final assembly. Most importantly, the new procedures proved themselves in the field under conditions that would have destroyed a Liberty ship. Off Okinawa in April 1945, the SS Wanda Fuka struck a mine that tore a 20-foot gash in her hull. The crack raced toward the ship's centerline and stopped dead at a crack arrestor seam, a riveted section deliberately placed in the design. The ship didn't break in half. She didn't sink. Her crew conducted emergency repairs, and she steamed back to port under her own power. Compare that to the SS Richard Hovey, a Liberty ship that took a similar mine hit just 2 months earlier, in February 1945. The crack didn't stop. It propagated 90 feet along the hull, breaking the ship's back. The Richard Hovey sank in 14 minutes. 37 sailors died. That difference between a damaged ship that survived and one that became a mass grave came down to engineering decisions made based on Bessie Hamill's observations in a Richmond shipyard. Victory ships proved their worth in the most brutal conditions imaginable. In the North Atlantic, where water temperatures regularly dropped below 35 degrees Fahrenheit, dozens of Liberty ships had developed cracks or broken completely. The SS Hobart Baker, a Victory ship, made 17 runs to Murmansk through those same waters without a single structural failure. Sailors who had refused to board Liberty ships volunteered for Victory ship crews. The difference in morale was measurable and stark. By the time the war ended, 531 Victory ships had been built, every one of them using the welding procedures and design improvements that traced back to Hamill's practical insight. Not a single Victory ship suffered catastrophic structural failure. Not one split in half. Not one sank from hull cracking. The statistics tell the story. More than 2,500 Liberty ships reported serious structural problems. Victory ships, 0 catastrophic failures. Production hit record numbers. The SS Benjamin Warner was built in just 5 days and 11 hours, shattering even the Liberty ship speed records while maintaining the rigorous new quality standards. Then the report from the Naval Architect's Office arrived. The Bureau of Ships was not happy. They had spent years developing their own solution to the Liberty ship failures. Their approach was more conventional: reinforce weak points, add thicker plates, strengthen the frame structure. It was sound engineering by the book, and it required minimal changes to existing production lines. More importantly, it came from the proper channels, naval architects with degrees and decades of experience, not night shift welders with observations. The Bureau's alternative design looked impressive on paper. It addressed stress concentrations with additional structural members. It specified higher grade steel for critical areas. It added redundancy to load paths. What it didn't do was solve the fundamental problem of residual welding stress, because that problem wasn't well understood in structural engineering circles yet. The mathematics of weld-induced stress fields wouldn't be fully developed until the 1950s, but the Bureau had authority and institutional backing. They had the power to block contracts and slow approvals. When the Maritime Commission proposed the Victory ship design, incorporating Hamill's welding sequence and all the other improvements, the Bureau pushed back hard. The timeline of the bureaucratic war reads like a case study in institutional resistance. In December 1943, testing confirmed Hamill's approach dramatically reduced residual stress. In January 1944, Henry Kaiser proposed the Victory ship design. In February 1944, the Bureau of Ships demanded comparative testing against their reinforced Liberty design. The tests were scheduled for April 1944 at the Navy's testing facility. The conditions were carefully controlled. Both designs would be subjected to identical stress loading, temperature cycling, and impact testing. Witnesses included representatives from the Maritime Commission, the Navy, Kaiser's engineering team, and skeptical Bureau officials who made no secret of their belief that the Victory design was over-engineered and would prove unnecessary. The first test involved thermal shock, taking hull sections from room temperature and plunging them into tanks of near-freezing water while under load. The Liberty ship section, built with reinforcements but using traditional welding sequences, developed a crack at a hatch corner within 6 thermal cycles. The crack propagated 18 inches before being artificially stopped. The Victory ship section, built with center-out welding and rounded corners, showed no crack initiation even after 12 thermal cycles. The second test was direct impact, simulating mine damage or collision. Both sections received identical impacts from a controlled weight drop. The Liberty section cracked immediately along a weld line, the fracture running nearly 3 feet before arresting at a bulkhead. The Victory section bent and deformed but did not crack. The Bureau's observer, a senior naval architect named Commander Douglas Whitmore, was on record saying before the test that the Victory design was an unnecessary complication driven by civilian panic rather than sound engineering. After watching both tests, he requested the results be verified by independent analysis. The conclusions were identical. The contract was awarded to the Victory ship design in May 1944. Production ramped up through the summer. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, the first Victory ships were already at sea, carrying supplies to support the Normandy invasion. What they carried mattered less than the confidence they inspired. Sailors trusted these ships. Commanders could rely on them in any conditions. The logistics network that kept Allied forces supplied across 2 oceans depended on ships that wouldn't tear themselves apart. The cost of the institutional delay was measurable. Between January 1943, when the SS Schenectady broke in half, and May 1944, when the Victory design was finally approved, dozens of Liberty ships failed catastrophically. Hundreds developed cracks that required emergency repairs. Several sank, with loss of life. The Maritime Commission's final report estimated that if the Victory ship improvements had been implemented immediately when the failures first appeared, rather than after 15 months of testing and bureaucratic resistance, at least 5 ships and approximately 200 lives could have been saved. Commander Whitmore, to his credit, later wrote in his official report that the welding sequence modification proposed by industrial welders and validated by testing represents a fundamental advance in structural fabrication that should be adopted across all ship construction programs. He didn't mention Bessie Hamill by name. Few official documents did. But vindication in Washington didn't guarantee glory after the war. Of the 531 Victory ships built during the war, about 90 survived into the modern era, many serving in merchant fleets well into the 1980s and 1990s. They were workhorses, reliable, durable, trusted. Several were preserved as museum ships, monuments to American industrial capacity and engineering excellence. The SS Lane Victory, docked in Los Angeles, still makes occasional demonstration voyages. The 2,700 Liberty ships, by contrast, were mostly scrapped immediately after the war ended. Some estimates suggest that if the war had continued another year, the Liberty ship fleet would have required wholesale replacement due to accumulated structural fatigue and crack growth. The ships built for speed, not longevity, had a limited useful life even when they didn't break in half. Henry Kaiser, the industrialist who championed both programs, became a household name. His shipyards had demonstrated that American manufacturing could outproduce any enemy. After the war, he built an automotive empire and helped develop modern healthcare systems. He died in 1967, celebrated as an industrial titan. Bessie Hamill returned to civilian life in 1946 without public recognition. She didn't receive a medal. She wasn't called to testify before Congress. No newspaper profiles celebrated her contribution. Her insight was repackaged in formal engineering language and attributed to systematic investigation of welding procedures by Kaiser technical staff. The night shift welder who saw what the engineers missed became a footnote, her name absent from most historical accounts. That omission reveals something crucial about how innovation happens and who gets credit. The institutional narrative needs the innovation to come from proper channels, from credentialed experts following established methods. When a breakthrough comes from the shop floor, from practical observation by someone without the right credentials, the system struggles to acknowledge it. The insight gets appropriated, formalized, and reassigned to people with titles and degrees. But the real battle wasn't between Bessie Hamill and the engineering establishment. It was between two competing modes of knowledge, theoretical analysis versus practical experience. The engineers knew the mathematics of stress and strain. They understood material properties and structural mechanics. What they didn't know was how the manufacturing process itself, the specific sequence of welds, the accumulation of heat, the pattern of contraction, would create the failure modes they were trying to prevent. Hamill knew because she watched it happen every night. She saw the patterns, the warping, the stress. She didn't need equations. She needed permission to show what she'd observed, and a system willing to listen. The cost of gatekeeping wasn't just measured in Hamill's recognition. It was measured in the months between her initial observation in late 1943 and the final approval of the Victory design in mid-1944. It was measured in ships that cracked, sailors who died, and strategic capabilities that were compromised because the institutional machinery couldn't process information that came from the wrong source through the wrong channels. What enabled the breakthrough wasn't just Hamill's persistence. It was the Marines who championed unconventional solutions. Having learned through bitter experience that conventional wisdom could get men killed, it was Henry Kaiser who built his empire by ignoring what couldn't be done. It was the Truman Committee's investigation into war production failures, which created pressure to actually solve problems rather than protect reputations. Most importantly, it was the existential crisis of war itself, which made experimentation necessary and failure intolerable. Modern echoes of this story are everywhere. When SpaceX proposed landing orbital rockets vertically and reusing them, established aerospace companies, with decades of experience and thousands of engineers, declared it impossible, impractical, and economically nonsensical. SpaceX's approach came from first principles thinking and rapid iteration, not from following the established playbook. Today, those same companies are scrambling to develop reusable rockets because the impossible approach is revolutionizing the industry. In medical research, patient advocacy groups have repeatedly identified treatment protocols and drug combinations that clinical researchers initially dismissed. Patients living with conditions have knowledge that comes from direct experience, observations that don't fit into double-blind study designs but prove crucial for actual treatment effectiveness. The best outcomes happen when institutional expertise and lived experience work together rather than compete for authority. Military procurement reform continues to struggle with the same tension. Soldiers in the field improvise solutions to problems that weapons developers, working from requirements documents and theoretical threat models, never anticipated. The MRAP vehicle, which saved countless lives in Iraq and Afghanistan, was initially resisted by the Pentagon because it didn't fit existing procurement categories and came from urgent field demands rather than formal development programs. The pattern repeats because the underlying dynamic remains. Institutions develop antibodies against information that threatens established hierarchies, standard procedures, or professional pride. The more specialized and credentialed a field becomes, the harder it is for outsider observations to penetrate. The people doing the actual work, whether it's welding ships, treating patients, or fighting wars, see things that the planners and theorists miss. The question is whether the system has mechanisms to capture and act on that knowledge before catastrophic failure forces change. 3 transferable lessons emerge from the Liberty ship failure and the Victory ship success. First, frontline workers see what desk analysis misses. People who directly manipulate materials, operate equipment, or execute procedures develop intuitions about failure modes that mathematical models don't capture. Their knowledge is empirical, specific, and often difficult to articulate in formal language, which makes it easy to dismiss. But it's also grounded in reality in a way that theoretical predictions are not. Second, the courage to slow down and do it right is often the fastest path forward. Kaiser's record-breaking 4-die Liberty ship looked like a triumph until those ships started cracking. The 18-day Victory ship, initially seen as a production failure, proved far more valuable because it actually worked. Speed that produces unreliable results costs more in the long run than thoroughness that takes time up front. This lesson applies to software development, manufacturing, infrastructure construction, and any domain where pressure to deliver fast conflicts with pressure to deliver quality. Third, the most expensive test program is the one where your customers discover the failures. The Liberty Ship program conducted the largest and most costly stress testing program in history, except they called it operations instead of testing, and the consequences were measured in ships sunk and sailors killed. Proper testing, rigorous quality control, and genuine problem-solving before deployment would have cost a fraction of the operational failures. Organizations that shortcut validation because it seems slow or expensive are simply deferring the costs to a point where they're much higher and often measured in lives. Bessie Hamill died in 1987 in modest circumstances in the San Francisco Bay Area. By then, the welding procedures she observed into existence were so thoroughly embedded in structural fabrication standards that most engineers didn't know their origin story. Textbooks on welding engineering describe center-out sequencing and stress relief procedures as fundamental practices discovered through systematic investigation of production failures. The specific person who made the key observation had been erased from the official narrative. Her contribution absorbed into the institutional memory as something the system figured out rather than something an outsider saw. But every structural weld in every modern building, bridge, pipeline, pressure vessel, and ship hull is made using principles that trace back to what a night shift welder observed in a Richmond shipyard in 1943. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline, 800 miles of welded steel operating in conditions that would shatter improperly stressed welds, was built using Victory ship welding procedures. Nuclear reactor pressure vessels, where failure would be catastrophic, are welded with the same attention to sequence and stress relief that Hamill advocated for. Offshore oil platforms, after disasters like Alexander Keeland and Piper Alpha killed hundreds of workers, rediscovered and formalized the same principles. When Marine Corps Lieutenant General Holland Smith, the officer who would later command the island-hopping campaign across the Pacific, was asked in 1944 what innovation had most improved amphibious operations, he didn't cite radar or cryptography or even air superiority. He said, ships that don't crack in half in cold water. He meant Victory ships, the vessels that could be trusted to reach their destination regardless of conditions. Ships that worked not because they were built fast, but because someone noticed how stress accumulated in welds and had the courage to say something even though she wasn't supposed to have a voice. The SS Schenectady sat in Portland Harbor for months after breaking in two, a visible reminder of engineering hubris. Eventually, she was cut up for scrap, the steel recycled into new ships. Victory ships built with better understanding of how metal behaves under stress and how manufacturing processes create or prevent failure. That transformation, from catastrophic failure to reliable success, didn't happen because theorists finally figured out the equations. It happened because a welder watched carefully, thought critically, and refused to stay silent even when silence would have been easier. Every time you cross a welded bridge, fly in an aircraft with welded components, or depend on any structure where metal sections have been joined rather than cast as a single piece, you're trusting in principles that a woman named Bessie Hamill had to fight to make anyone hear. The ships stopped tearing themselves apart because someone who wasn't supposed to understand engineering understood the one thing that mattered most: how the real world behaves when you're not watching. That's the legacy worth remembering. Not just the victory ships that served reliably for decades, or the lives saved by hulls that didn't crack, but the fundamental principle that truth doesn't care about credentials and expertise doesn't have a monopoly on insight. The next Bessie Hamill's out there right now, watching something that everyone else thinks they understand, seeing a pattern that the experts are missing. The question is whether anyone will listen before failure forces the issue.